welcome at last to Greyfriars churchyard. We're going to see the graves of people that featured in Harry Potter, as this is where J.K. Rowling got the inspiration for the names of some of her characters. We shall see famous people that are buried here, and we're going to visit the most famous grave in Greyfriars, Bobby the dog. So come, walk with me around one of the most haunted and Gothic graveyards in Britain. So for nearly 400 years, this land has been the place for many chapters in Edinburgh's history. So let's start with a bit of this history. Many years ago it was thought that, like the word Christ, the word church was pronounced kirk. Somehow, over the years, the K pronunciation of ch turned into the ch sound we say now. The sound of the word Christ hasn't changed, but kirk became church, and is now said to be the Scottish word for church. Burials have been taking place here since the late 16th century, and there is reported to be over 100,000 bodies here. A man who was tending the garden told me that before the gates are opened in the morning, if it is rain hard overnight, like it does in Scotland and all over Britain really, it is wise to walk the graveyard to see if any bones have washed up in the water. If so, they are taken and reburied before the gates are open to the public. Now I know this to be true of plague pits, but I'm not sure whether this happens here. I don't know. It very well might. So let's start our wander round the graveyards. And the first graveyard we are going to investigate is that of a murder victim. Captain John Poitius lived from 1695 to September the 7th, 1736. He was the captain of Edinburgh City Guard, but that was not what he was remembered for. In 1736, a trial took place in Edinburgh of an Andrew Wilson, George Robinson and William Hall. Their crime? Well, it was smuggling and attempted robbery. Hall was sentenced to the colonies for life, but Wilson and George were sentenced to hang. They were imprisoned in Edinburgh's Tolboth until the hanging could be carried out. Robertson escaped when friends bent the bars outside the window of his cell. But on April the 4th, 1736, Andrew Wilson was hanged in Edinburgh at Grassmarket. The public sympathised with the smuggling and hated excisemen, which is whom they robbed of. When Wilson's body was cut down, a riot broke out. Guards were sent to the riot, but they were attacked by the mob. Porteous ordered the mob to disperse. He was, of course, ignored, so he gave the order to his men to fire over the heads of the crowd, but some of the crowd were inadvertently injured, so Porteous then gave the order to fire into the crowd. 6 people were sadly killed and as many as 20 were wounded. Porteous was charged with murder that same afternoon. He was sentenced to hang on 8th of September 1736. But Sir Robert Walpole, the Prime Minister, arranged for a royal pardon for Porteous. News spread of this and caused a public outrage. A mob of around 4,000 people armed with weapons broke into the prison where Porteous was being held. They dragged him to the Grassmarket and lynched him. He was buried here at Greyfriars with a headstone that just read P 1736. His headstone was replaced at a later date with the one that we see here today. So, linked closely to Greyfriars is St Giles Kirk, or church. That churchyard became oversaturated with the dead in the late 1500s. So this land was given to the Scots to be used for burials by Mary Queen of Scots in 1562. Between 1562 and 1900, nearly 100,000 people were buried in Greyfriars. St Giles was being restored in 1879 and several tons of human bones from unmarked graves in the middle of the church were removed and reinterred here at Greyfriars Kirkyard. Here we have the resting place of John Bain of Picardie. He was a writer to the signet born in Scotland. Writers to the signet were the solicitors entitled to supervise the use of the King's signet, which is the private seal of the early kings of Scott. A signet is a private society of Scottish solicitors dating back to 1594. This grave marker dates back to 1667 and commemorates a Joni Milne. Now Joni is not famous, but I just wanted to show you the detail on the grave markers. So much money were thrown into the graves back in these days. Here we have the most visited and most loved grave of all of Greyfriars, and that is a Skye Terrier called Bobby, who was known in the 19th century Edinburgh for spending 14 years guarding the grave of his master. Bobby died on the 14th of January 1872. Bobby was reported to have belonged to a man called Mr. John Gray. Here is a photo of Bobby with his family. So Gray worked for the Edinburgh City Police as a night watchman. When John Gray died, Bobby for the next 14 years would sit on his master's grave. He became very well known around the graveyard and amongst the locals. They took him under his wing and looked after him. When Bobby died, he was reportedly buried just inside the gate of the Greyfriars Kirkyard, near or not far from John Gray's grave itself. Here we have just another wonderful memorial of skeletons dancing. I absolutely love these. I think these are brilliant. It's just a shame that it's a bit worn. So next up we have Duncan Forbes of Culloden. He was a Scottish lawyer and Whig politician who sat in the House of Commons from 1721 to 1737. He played a major role in helping the government suppress the 1745 Jacobite Rising. Forbes died on the 10th of December 1747. So, running through the Greyfriars churchyard is what's called Flodden's Wall. Many of the memorials are on or built into this wall. The Flodden Wall was completed in 1560 to protect the city against an English invasion that never came. At the Battle of Flodden in 1513, the Scottish forces were defeated and King James IV was killed. Edinburgh officials feared the English troops would soon descend upon the Scottish city, so they decided to build a wall to defend their city. The wall became ruined in the 18th century. Now, parts of the wall are integrated into buildings or, as you can see here, incorporated into the grand memorials. The earliest surviving gravestone here dates back to the year in which the burial ground opened, which is 1580. Greyfriars has a vast variety of gravestones of many different sizes and styles, some bearing symbols of mortality and some of the trades of the individuals interred here, dating back to the 1700s. We also cannot come and wander about the graveyard and not talk about, yep, the infamous Burke and Hare. So, Burke and Hare were murderers. They killed 16 people over a period of about 10 months in 1828 in Edinburgh in Scotland. They killed them to sell the corpses to a man called Robert Knox for dissection at his autonomy lectures. Edinburgh, you see, was ahead of the world when it came to anatomical study in the early 19th century. The research was going at such a pace that cadavers were in such short supply. The resurrectionists, or body snatchers as we know them of, were being thwarted by armed guards at watchtowers and by relatives burying their dead with mortsaves on top of them to stop the body snatchers from digging up the freshly buried corpses at graveyards. Because of this, Burke and Hare decided to make their own cadavers. The idea was born when a lodger died suddenly in Hare's house. After a discussion with his friend Burke, they decided to sell the body to Knox. They realised they would receive a large sum of money for a body, so the killings began. Their murders were uncovered after other lodgers discovered their last victim's body and contacted the police. Police suspected Burke and Hare of the murder, but there was no evidence on which they could take action, so an offer was put to Hare granting him immunity if he confessed, which he did. At his trial, Burke was found guilty of one murder and sentenced to death. Burke was hanged shortly afterwards. His corpse was dissected and ironically used for research. His skin was treated and used to bind books, and some of them still survive today. And you see all those skeletons in the doctor's office hanging from the poles? Yep, they're all models of his skeleton. It's still displayed in the Anatomical Museum of Edinburgh Medical School, where it can still be seen today. So away from the grimness of Burke and Hare, I guess we better travel back into the graveyard. So Greyfriars isn't so much famous for who is buried here, it's famous for what happened here. So the National Covenant was signed in the graveyard in 1638, and following the Battle of Bothwell Bridge in 1679, 1,200 prisoners were brought to Edinburgh. The prisons were already full around the city, so a makeshift prison was made in a field south of Greyfriars churchyard and held around the 400 prisoners. This was thought to be an ideal place as the area was enclosed on two sides by the Flodden Wall and on a third side a building. The fourth side, though, faced into the churchyard. It was patrolled and guarded by a picket fence. This part of the graveyard is still known today as the Covenanters' Prison. Sadly, it is now kept locked due to vandals, and this is where the Black Mausoleum is. Which leads us nicely on to the haunting of Greyfriars. The ghost of George Mckenzie is supposed to roam the graveyard. You see, the Covenanters had petitioned the king to allow freedom to practice their religion without interference. To crush the rebellion, George was the merciless judge who presided over the trials of the Presbyterian Covenanters. And these are the prisoners that ended up in the churchyard, so we've come full circle. Many of the prisoners here were executed and hundreds died of maltreatment. There was no roof or shelter within the churchyard and barely any food was given to them. In a twist of fate, George Mckenzie, when he died, was buried in the Black Mausoleum, I keep saying Mausoleum, within the Covenanters' prison. Upset at being imprisoned in the Covenant's graveyard, bloody Mckenzie may be dead and gone, but his spirit is said to live on. He is supposed to roam around the graveyard and physically attack people. So, inside this graveyard, we also find the real-life graves of people in Harry Potter. So J.K. Rowling found her inspiration here for the names of her characters within the books, so it is now commonly known as the Harry Potter Cemetery. William Mcgonagall was said to be the most celebrated worst poet of his time and now in British history. J.K. Rowling is said to have loved the idea that this William was a distant relation to the Minerva Mcgonagall in Harry Potter. Oh. So this is where the inspiration for Alistair Mad-Eye Moody is said to have come from. There are many Potters in Greyfriars, so it was hard to tell which grave actually gave any inspiration to Rowling, whether it was all of them or just one of them. It was so hard to tell. Well, I'm so pleased that if you've made it to the end of the video, that you have joined me on this journey around Greyfriars. It is brilliant. I would advise anyone to go. It's so old, macabre. It's amazing. So I highly recommend it. What's you having that on the wall of your house?
That'd be great. You'd love it.
I would, yeah.
So
I know, but some people wouldn't, would they? That would be my dream home.
Looking straight out.
Yeah, doors open straight. my goodness. Oh crumbs. Right Honourable Eric Milligan. To mark the 400th anniversary of the death of William Little. So is this William Little? Right?
Yeah.
Is it?
Oh, here it is.
Can't really see his tomb.
Lord Provost of the city of it. Oh.